Hey guys, how's it going? It's John again from Haive Music, and today I wanted to go over more of a advanced routing technique that can help enable you to work around one of the major limitations in Ableton that involves basically taking a single track's output and routing that internally to multiple tracks, or rather taking a single I guess in this case, basically taking a single sidechain output and basically routing that to multiple external third-party VSTs, which under Ableton, as you probably know if you've looked into this before, isn't necessarily easily done. A lot of people even say it can't be done, but it definitely can, and I've found basically three methods for working around this in Ableton. Basically, one of them involves using Ableton stock routing, internal routing inside of its software, and the other two methods involve using a Max for Live device, which greatly simplifies things. But yeah, make no mistake about it. I mean, each one of these three methods is, each one has its particular pros and its particular cons associated with it, none of which is basically a seamless process. If you're familiar with other external third-party plugin usage on other DAWs, it's basically, if you want to route something into them, they typically, although not always, but they typically route, or I shouldn't say route, but they wrap a third-party VST inside of another window, and then they usually have like a little thing up here in the top right-hand corner, such as like Logic or some other very popular DAWs. They have like an actual input section up here in the top right that allows you to basically grab any track from your project and use that as a particular input for the VST. But as you can see in Ableton, no such wrapper or routing method exists, so we kind of have to work around this issue. And it's again, some of you might be asking, like, why would you want to be doing this when you typically don't have a huge need for it? And the answer to that is basically to gain additional flexibility in your workflow and your what you're working on your project. So take for instance, right now we're using, I've got this track I've been working on, and I've been using a sidechain compressor on it. And as you can hear, I mean, the sidechain compressor works. It's doing its job. It's ducking when the bass and, or I should say, the kick and the snare hit. And that's all fine and good for 99% of the tracks out there. In most particular instances of almost anything, this is going to be more than sufficient. But there are certain instances, say for example, I guess, probably the next most common thing that you want to be using this for would be taking a step up from regular compression and going into multi-band sidechain compression, which differs, of course, from regular compression, as to where regular compression would be compressing the entire frequency range when your sidechain hits or triggers the compressor. Multi-band compression in regards to sidechaining would basically be compressing only a single band or multiple bands, depending upon how you have everything set up when your sidechain hits. So, in an instance where you only wanted the lows, and, I don't know why you do this, but maybe you want the highs and the lows to duck out of the way when a particular sidechain trigger hits, but you want the mids left alone, you could do that with a multi-band compressor. However, you couldn't really do that with regular compressor unless you were to have multiples and you applied some sort of filtering to them, and that's a whole nother topic for debate. But just to make our lives easier, multi-band compression exists, obviously, to help with these types of things. So why not utilize it? So that is what I'm going to be basically using in this example to show you. And let's just kind of dive right into it. Let's find a section of our track here that's not too busy. Maybe just this guy right here. We don't need more than 4. That should be. So yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to work with this leads group here, just to keep things simple. And for the first example here, we're going to go over using the built-in routing inside of Ableton, as I personally feel, even though this isn't the easiest to set up, This is probably the method that I would choose. So basically what I would end up doing is, let's expand this a little bit. Let's create another group and call this a processing group. And we'll just take care of doing our processing inside of this group just to keep things a little tidier, which you'll see is important when you're doing this kind of routing inside of Ableton. So the unfortunate downside to doing this method is you basically need 2 tracks for setting this type of routing up in Ableton. And let's go ahead, and now that we've got our 2 tracks created, let's go ahead and just clean out the default plugins because we don't want that. Not necessary, not needed. So yeah, basically we've got our 2 tracks here. We're gonna use basically one as a bus, as a transport layer to go from our chain into our container, our sidechain container. And then this is of course going to be where we put our plugin, our container. So let's go ahead and set these up as leads. We're just gonna call this a transport bus, and we're going to call this a leads sidechain container just for the sake of keeping things simple here. So now that we have our 2 tracks, what we want to do is we need to first and foremost route our output from leads into our container. So if you've watched any of my previous tutorials, you'll see that I've kind of touched on this topic before, but if you don't see this section here, what you need to do is this little IO button. You got to click this guy and enable this section. And once that's in there, you can change the output routing from our master. We're going to set this to our container here. And what that's doing is effectively telling Ableton to route the audio from leads group into our leads container here. And the last thing we need to do for that, we need to change this to an input track. And then now you can see when we play it, Ableton's doing just that. It's routing our audio into this group here. So we've got our container set up. Now the next step here is let's go ahead and throw our plugin on there. And we're just going to go ahead and set up a simple sidechain. We're going to drop our range all the way down, drop our threshold, our attack, bring the release up just to accentuate what we're doing. And finally, we're going to set this to an external input. And that should be all we need. And it's important to know that we need both the container as well as the plugin set up before we can move further. And the reason behind that is because we need to go into our transport bus here. And now we've got our track input and we've got a track output. So what we're going to need to do is change the output from the group to our container. And then now that the container's set, we've got our additional plugin that we could choose that's on the container. So that's basically telling Ableton to take whatever's in here and shove it right into our plugin here that's located in our container. Now the other thing we need to do, we basically need to feed the sidechain into our transport bus now. And you know, you could set up your sidechain directly from your kick and your snare if you want. Personally, I like to have a little bit more control over my attack and release time, so I opt to use ghost notes, ghost kicks, I guess if you want. I call them chains. Excuse me. Again, I've touched on this in previous videos, so nothing fancy. It's basically just set up to trigger whenever I have a kick or a snare set up, and it just makes it look like you can see they're lined up. So again, go check out some previous videos if you want to learn more about that. But for right now, that's basically, you know, all you need to do is this is going to be our trigger for our sidechain, and we're really not interested in this 4/4. We're more interested in the actual chain. So what we want to do is basically use our transport bus here, and now we're going to change the input to our chain. And what this does, obviously we need to set this to an in, is this should now start routing audio with one exception. So if we click this, you can see it's, you know, this is our side chain is being triggered, but it's being routed to, it's picking up here, but it's not there quite yet. It's not finished. We need to do one more thing, and that's we need to change this to pre-effects or post-effects. But I mean, it would probably be better just to do, you know, pre-effects on here. And once that's set, that's all you need to do. And our sidechain is working, as you can see. And the huge advantage here is, again, now we're not compressing the whole band. We're only compressing the tiny little sub-frequency bands here. I shouldn't say it's not really sub, it's more just bass frequency band. And the nice thing is, I mean, I don't know why you'd want to do this, but again, this allows additional flexibility. So if we want to, compress both the lows and the highs, we can do that now, while leaving the mids alone. So, just kind of set this up again, similar way, external. And yeah, I mean, you can just, the possibilities here are endless. And it just goes to show you exactly what you could do with this, what you couldn't do before with just using a standard compressor. So, and to take this a little bit further, what we can do now is show you an example of, basically using an additional, like, if you wanted to have excuse me, you don't really want that on there, but if you wanted another plug in here, say we wanted to put, just for example, a compressor on there, you would probably want something other than 2 compressors, but for the sake of demonstration purposes, this will be fine. Let's go ahead and set this again to an external source, and that should be good for this. So yeah, like I said here, in order to route a single location to a single source to multiple plugins here, we have to have a transport bus for every plugin we want to do that with. So basically what we need to do is duplicate that, and then we'll just this will be our multiband transport bus, and this will be our transport bus for just the regular compressor. And you can see this one's still set up. They're both set up, sidechain, container, and then this is MB. And now this is, we're going to change this to Pro C2. And so now we've got 2 transport buses, one for the multiband compressor, one for the regular compressor on our container. Oops, we want to turn auto gain off on that. And now you can see they're both being triggered, which is exactly what you want. So yeah, that's great. It's fantastic. That works. It leads your track to start becoming a little bit more messy and convoluted. I mean, obviously you're creating a transport bus for every single plugin you want to use, and you have to have a container, and you have to set the routing up. So it gets pretty complicated, and it starts to get pretty messy. What I would personally do to help combat the messiness is I would start grouping this inside of groups, and I would just call this leads transport bus. We'll just leave it a bus and do that. And then I would probably do a sidechain container group, and then this would be more of a transport bus group, I guess. Bus groups, yeah. So then you basically start to have a little bit of cleanup and organization in your project. And then the nice thing here is, say, that's great. We got our leads done. Now, you want to do the bass. So obviously you would need to do the same thing. You would basically need to duplicate your track, and you would then go ahead and set up this as a bass sidechain container. We're just going to focus on regular compression for this, and here again, this is a leads transport bus now. So let's go ahead and duplicate this, and we're not going to need the multiband, so let's just get rid of that, and we'll go ahead and rename this to bass, and go ahead and rename this to bass. And so now we've got this set up. What we need to do here now is basically change the routing in this guy to go to our bus for excuse me, not the leads. We need the bus for the bass. So here we go, bass sidechain, and then we can route that into the compressor for the bass. And then what I would probably do in addition to this is I would also group each one of these transport bus groups together and make a group above them that basically would just be called transport bus groups. And then that way you've now got your sidechain for your leads and your bass. And then on the bass, we've got the same thing here. And everything's a little bit tidier. You know, you've still got these kind of set up, but things are super messy. I mean, yeah, you've got a lot of tracks. I mean, just to do that, I mean, basically we've got, you know, all these tracks set up just to do that simple routing here, but it works. It definitely does take a little while to wrap your head around what's going on and to go through and set this up without getting kind of confused and tripping over everything. But it certainly is possible. And while this is, you know, obviously a huge pain in the butt to set up, I personally feel that this works the best. It's not the easiest, but it certainly does work well. So, like I said, give that a shot, follow through, and it might help you guys out. But in addition to doing that method, there are basically there are two other methods that I found, and that's basically using Max for Live devices here. So obviously, if you're using Ableton 10, it has Max for Live already installed, so you don't have to do that. But if you have a prior version, say Ableton 9 or earlier, you would obviously need to make sure that you have Max for Live installed before you go ahead and do this. We'll just, I guess the second way I found, we'll just use the built-in, or it's not built-in, but it's an Ableton created way. So Ableton created this surround panner Max for Live device, and this does not come, as far as I know, with Ableton itself. You basically have to go to Ableton's website and search for surround panner Max for Live device, and it is a free download. So go ahead and check that guy out. So I'm going to show you how to go ahead and use that, and it works pretty much the same way and eliminates a lot of the additional steps that we did before, but you still need a sidechain container. So we're gonna again do just lead. So we're just gonna call this lead sidechain container just to keep things nice and sane. Okay, the same way. Let's go ahead and clean our default plugins off. We don't need them, and we're gonna drag this Max for Live device here, which is located Max for Live, Max for Live, Max Audio Effect, and Surround Panner. We can just drag that right onto our container. And then now, you'll see this operates very similarly to the routing. That's basically all it's doing, is it's still just routing that. So, excuse me, I'm sorry, we don't want this here. We want this actually on the chain, sorry. So we'll put that on our chain. Just like before, we actually want our compressor on there. So we're going to put our compressor on our container, and we're going to set that up for external range is fine. External, here we go. Okay, so now we're set. We've got our plugin on our container, and our chain gets the Max for Live device here. So again, this is something that you want set up ahead of time. You have to have your container with the plugin already on it, and then you can go in here and we can find our container, and then here we go, there's our compressor. So we go ahead and select that, and that will begin to allow us to route the output of our chain into our compressor. Now, the one major difference here between the two methods is when you're using this plugin, you have to have the track enabled. If you have it disabled, the output won't get fed into it. I mean, as you can see, we're getting audio into the actual device itself, but the device isn't doing any routing, as you can see. So what we need to do is basically enable this. And now, as you can hear, the device is working and it's routing into our plugin, which is great. But the one annoying thing, obviously, we don't want is we don't want the chain feeding back into our track. We don't want to hear that. So what we need to do is go back into our output here, not our input, but our output. Go down to sends only, and we're going to set our chain to sends only, and that's basically it. And it's as simple as that. And obviously, if you were to load another plugin on here, you could also set this up the same way. Just for the sake of doing it, go through it real quick and show you what I mean. We're going to set this to external. Now, the one thing to keep in mind here is I have found that you can load multiple instances of this application. Now, this has to do 1 and 2. This isn't 4 tracks per routing. Basically, this is your outputs. 1 and 2, which typically your monitors. I have advanced routing, so I have 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7, 8. But really, I've only got these 2 enabled in Ableton. So you don't really need to know about that. The important thing is to note that if you need to route to additional plugins, what you need to do is have an additional version of this. And then the important thing here is you see these are synced, which kind of defeats the purpose, you might think. But what you need to do is go ahead and turn this share setup off. And what that allows you to do is now you can make sure your container is enabled. And now we can set this to our multiband. And we need to make sure this is set to our regular compressor. So we got our compressor and we got a multiband. And now we're using multiple instances to route to multiple plugins. Except I forgot this. The reason why we're not getting audio is we need to route this to our container as well. And now, except we need to, yeah, we need to set this as an input. There we go. And that's using Ableton's actual Max for Live device. That's all there is to it. The last Max for Live device is very similar, and it behaves the same way. It just seems it probably has a little bit overhead, a little bit less overhead, I should say. Now this is made by a third party. Some dude made this. I don't know his name, unfortunately, but it's called Simple Audio Route Max for Live device. And if you Google that, you'll find it. And again, you would just put this on the source that you want to route to multiple destinations, and it behaves the same way. You get your container or your track that you want to route to, and your plugin. And if you want to route it to multiple plugins, just simple as this: container. So yeah, it's as simple as that. I mean, obviously this is probably the easiest solution, probably also the cleanest. Ableton's Max for Live device and this one, I don't know if they have any latency issues. It doesn't appear that they do. I don't really think there's any problems using those. They're certainly a lot easier than setting up the default routing internally in Ableton. Personally, for me, I would probably still just use Ableton's default routing, just to keep things a little bit cleaner, where I'm not, it's basically the lesser of two evils. Are you going to have a whole bunch of extra tracks that are on there, or are you going to add Max for Live overhead and that kind of stuff? It's really up to you. Probably depends on what you're going to use it for. But for my case and my instances, I think I'm probably still going to just stick often with using a standard Ableton built-in compressor where I can get by with it and just easily select what I want there and not monkey around with everything else. But the nice thing is that these other options are there. They are available to be used should you want to use them, and they do certainly work. So that's the nice thing about it. So it's it's a pain in the butt to wrap your head around and to keep organized and set up, but once it's up and working, it does seem to work quite well. So yeah, hopefully that helps you guys out, and you can use that for multi-band compression. Maybe you want to do some side chaining with that. Maybe you want to do some use some envelope shaping or some envelope generators or something like that with some external triggering. The sky's the limit using each one of these methods, and they all accomplish the same thing to various degrees of effort being required to put in, but yeah, they all seem to work quite well in my experience. So I'll probably experiment around with each one of them a little bit more to see which one I personally like. But it's nice to know that it does certainly work, and hopefully this will help you guys out. So yeah, thanks for watching.